The fuel carried by aircraft is highly regulated. For those outside the industry, it might be believed that an aircraft carries only the fuel that is required to fly from one airfield to another airfield. But it's not entirely true, as aircraft under commercial operations carry a lot more than that. Let's take a look at all the fine details in today's video. Ultimately, the amount of fuel to be carried for a flight depends on local air regulations. This policy must be written by the airline in their operations manual based on these rules. Generally, the policy must be based on the following: fuel data provided by the aircraft manufacturer, fuel data derived by the airline based on the aircraft age, performance, etc. on a fuel consumption monitoring program, fuel burn increase due to increased aircraft weight, expected meteorological conditions in the routes operated by the airline. The fuel for a commercial flight is divided into taxi fuel, trip fuel, contingency fuel, alternate fuel, final reserve fuel, additional fuel, and extra fuel. Let's go through these one by one. Taxi fuel is the amount of fuel required to taxi the aircraft from the gate to the runway for takeoff. It also includes fuel burnt at the gate due to the operation of the Auxiliary Power Unit or APU. Trip fuel is what's required to fly from the destination aerodrome to the arrival aerodrome. It should include fuel for takeoff, climb, and cruise, and it should also consider the departure route, since some airports have longer Standard Instrument Departures or SIDs, which may require the uplifting of more fuel. As the term contingency fuel suggests, this is uplifted to account for unforeseen circumstances such as changes in the weather, route changes due to air traffic control constraints, holding, etc. The contingency fuel should be higher than 5% of planned trip fuel, or in the event of in-flight replanning, 5% of the trip fuel for the rest of the flight. However, it should not be less than 3% of the trip fuel. This is typically allowed by the regulators if the route has an en route alternate. The alternate fuel is what's required to divert if the pilots fail to land at the destination for some reason. The alternate is chosen by the airline before the flight, and sometimes two or more possible alternates are provided in the flight plan. The fuel for alternate should include fuel that is required for a missed approach at the applicable minima at the destination airfield to the published missed approach altitude. This should include the complete missed approach procedure. Fuel for the climb from missed approach altitude to the cruising altitude to the alternate aerodrome. This should also consider the SIDs at the destination. Fuel to cruise from top of climb to top of descent. Here, the complexity of the Standard Instrument Arrival Route, or STARS, at the alternate aerodrome should be looked at. Fuel from top of descent to the initial approach fix, or where the approach for landing begins. And fuel to perform an approach and landing at the alternate aerodrome. The final reserve fuel is the absolute minimum fuel that is required for an aircraft to remain airborne safely. Ideally, pilots should not ever get to the point of needing this fuel. If for some reason the pilots feel that their fuel load will drop to final reserve, a mayday should be declared. The final reserve for an aircraft with turbine engines is the fuel that is required to fly for 30 minutes at holding speed at 1,500 feet above the alternate aerodrome. The aircraft weight to calculate this fuel should not be less than its estimated weight when it reaches the alternate. To be conservative, airlines can choose a higher weight as increments in weight increase fuel burn. For an aircraft with piston engines, this fuel is required to fly for 45 minutes. This difference is because turbine engines are more reliable than piston engines. The category of additional fuel is an interesting one. Not all airlines, or to be more accurate, not all routes, have additional fuel as a minimum fuel requirement. However, certain operations, such as ETOPS, require airlines to carry additional fuel when flying ETOPS routes. This is the fuel required to divert to an ETOPS alternate with engine failure and/or loss of pressurization. Finally, we come to what is categorized as extra fuel. This is fuel carried at the discretion of the captain of the flight. The captain is authorized to carry more than the flight plan fuel based on their judgment. However, many times airlines require captains to give justifications for any extra fuel that is carried. Let's now examine Reduced Contingency Fuel, or RCF, or in-flight replanning. We previously said that a minimum of 5% of trip fuel must be carried as contingency fuel. It also stated that if the in-flight replanning procedure is followed, you only need 5% required for the remaining part of the flight. The 5% may not be an issue for a short flight. However, for longer flights with higher trip fuels, the contingency fuel can skyrocket. So how does RCF, or in-flight replanning, work? Let's say you're planning to fly from destination A to B, and when the fuel is calculated, it shows that 80,000 kilograms of fuel is required to fly this route. Now, as a contingency of 5% of this trip fuel is a part of the minimum fuel to be legal, you must carry an additional 4,000 kilograms of fuel, 5% of 80,000 kilograms. As you can imagine, this is a lot of fuel. Now, if you want to reduce this contingency amount, you could use the RCF, or the in-flight replanning procedure. To follow this procedure, you can find an aerodrome that is closer to A than B. We'll call this Aerodrome C. You then find out that to fly from A to C, only 50,000 kilograms of fuel is needed. This means your contingency now falls to 2,500 kilograms. So you will initially make a flight plan from A to C to fly to Aerodrome B, your original destination. This flight plan must include a decision point, maybe close to your top of descent to Aerodrome C. At this decision point, you make a quick fuel calculation to see whether you have enough fuel to reach Aerodrome B from the decision point, plus 5% of the fuel that is required to fly from the decision point to Aerodrome B. If it is determined that you have enough fuel as above, you will simply do an in-flight replanning to destination B. The leeway given by the regulators is that if such a replanning in-flight is done, at the decision point you're only required to have 5% of the fuel that is needed to fly from the decision point to the destination, in our case, Aerodrome B. So how is the minimum fuel for such a procedure determined? Well, it should be one of these two options shown here, whichever is the larger amount. Now let's examine Predetermined Point, or PDP procedure. When flying to places that are isolated, an alternate aerodrome can be quite far from the destination. In these situations, the flight can only be routed via a predetermined point. The predetermined is the point where the fuel in the aircraft is only enough to reach either the destination aerodrome or the alternate aerodrome. So before the PDP, pilots should make a calculation to make sure they have enough fuel to continue to the destination. To apply this procedure, the fuel should be the greatest of A or B, as shown here. So how do pilots calculate the required fuel? The Airline Dispatch Office prepares the flight plan, which specifies the minimum fuel required to fly from one aerodrome to the other. This fuel is based on current wind and temperature data, so it should be fairly accurate. However, pilots many times take extra fuel for their own comfort, particularly when the weather is bad. To calculate how much they can carry, an underload can be calculated. The underload is the amount of weight that can be carried in the aircraft without exceeding any limiting weights with passengers and cargo loaded. For an airliner, there are three main limiting weights: the maximum takeoff weight, or MTOW, the maximum zero fuel weight, or MZFW, and the maximum landing weight, or MLW. Since it's always easier to work out an example, let's use one now. Say an aircraft has weights as follows: MTOW 100,000 kilograms, MZFW 90,000 kilograms, MLW 95,000 kilograms, current zero fuel weight or ZFW 80,000 kilograms. The fuel is as follows. Block fuel or total fuel is 15,000 kilograms. Trip fuel equals 10,000 kilograms. Taxi fuel equals 300 kilograms. Then the underload calculation is as follows. For MTOW, 100,000 minus 80,000 minus the result of 15,000 minus 300, our result here is 5,300 kilograms. For the MZFW, we subtract 80,000 from 90,000 to get a result of 10,000 kilograms. Finally, for MLW, 80,000 is subtracted from 95,000, then we subtract the result of 15,000 minus 10,000 minus 300. This gives us an answer of 10,300 kilograms. According to these calculations, the limiting weight is MTOW and the underload is 5,300 kilograms. What all this means is that if more than 5,300 kilograms of fuel is uplifted, the MTOW will be exceeded. So in this case, the pilot can carry 5,300 kilograms of fuel without exceeding any weight limitation of the aircraft. By now, it's clear just how important fuel calculations are and how much is factored in before a flight. Although most flights reach their destinations with enough fuel on board, there have been a few instances of the aircraft running out of fuel mid-air. One of the most famous examples is that involving an Air Canada Boeing 767. It was on July 23, 1983 that Air Canada Flight 143 from Montreal and Edmonton, operated by a Boeing 767-200, had double engine failure mid-flight. The plane had been delivered to Air Canada from Boeing 4 months earlier. Meanwhile, the aircraft type itself had only been introduced into service 10 months prior, and Charlie Golf Alpha Uniform November was the 47th example to roll out from the assembly line. This was the first aircraft in the Air Canada fleet to use kilograms on the fuel gauges, and the measurements needed to be entered in kilograms per litre. The cockpit crew then entered the value into the aircraft's FMC without recalculating it for metric values. So instead of tanking the 20,088 litres of fuel required for the return flight to Edmonton, the plane left with just under 5,000 litres. This was about half of what was needed to reach their destination. The captain behind the controls was an experienced glider pilot who managed to maneuver the plane towards a runway in Gimli, an old Air Force base that had been turned into a racetrack. Thankfully, it all turned out well, and the plane landed without any severe injuries to passengers or crew. Did you know that so much went into fuel calculations before a flight? Let us know by leaving a comment. Simple Flying publishes over 150 articles every week. If you're looking for the latest aviation news and insights, visit simpleflying.com.